The Reformation period. Introduction. In this class we will cover the Magisterial Reform, the Anabaptist Reformation, the Magisterial Reform. The Protestant Reformation was of great importance in the history of the Church and in the development of its ministry. Arising out of the Pietism, mysticism, and scholarship of the late Middle Ages, its aim was to reform the existing Church in accordance with biblical principles. The church-state concept was in marked contrast to the free church thinking of the true Anabaptists who were trying to build a new church based on the Bible. In seeking to understand the contribution of the Reformation to biblical ministry, one must examine both the magisterial reformers, Luther, Bucer, Calvin, and Knox, and the free church, true Anabaptists. The former worked under the banner of Reformatio, reform, while the latter had Restitutio, restitution, as their banner. Both offer important perspectives. An examination of the reforms of Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546, and John Calvin, 1509 to 1564, reveals that they differed in degrees of progress towards the biblical pattern of ecclesiastical ministry. Ultimately, both advocated a church-state magisterial system, believing that any reform must culminate in a Christian state. Both made a distinction between visible and invisible church, understanding the invisible church as the one formed only by the elect. Their idea of the visible church, created by a magisterial church-state, made a simple doctrine of church and ministry impossible. Martin Bucer, 1491 to 1551, an important disciple of Luther and professor of Calvin, had an important ministry in Strasbourg. Tidball rightly calls him the pastoral theologian of the Reformation because of his extensive efforts to advance the office and work of the pastorate. In his De Regno Christi, Bucer identifies three tasks of the pastor. 1. Being a diligent teacher of the Holy Scriptures. 2. Administering the sacraments. 3. Participating in church discipline. The third, and sacred ceremonies, worship and fasting. Calvin's contribution to the biblical understanding of pastoral ministry is tremendous. Although he is primarily seen as a theologian and exegete, Calvin was also. He dedicates the fourth book of his Institutes to the Church, speaking of the need for this function. That the preaching of the gospel may flourish. He has set up pastors and teachers, Ephesians 4 verse 11. He gave them authority. Lastly, he omitted nothing that might contribute to the holy agreement of faith and due order. He used the title, Mother, for there is no way to enter into life except this mother conceive us in her womb, give birth to us, feed us at her breasts, and by finally, keep us under. Putting aside our mortal flesh, we become like angels, MT 22:30. Earlier writings described the fourfold office of pastor, teacher, elder, and deacon in Calvin's Geneva, which placed great emphasis on preaching, government, and pastoring. The pastor needs two voices, one to gather the flock and the other to drive away wolves and robbers. The Scriptures provide you with the means to do both. One cannot consider the period of the Reforms without describing the legacy of the biblical ministry of John Knox, 1514 to 1572. His letters and pastoral reports reflect a rich understanding of a commitment to preaching the word with great passion, deep interest, and care for the spiritual welfare of men. The Anabaptist Reformation. Anabaptism closely resembles the work and influence of Luther and Zwingli in their contribution to the biblical understanding of the Church and its ministry. As mentioned above, within the great universe known by the Anabaptists there was a smaller group whose faith was rooted in the Scriptures, constituting them true Anabaptists. These included men such as Conrad Grebel, 1495 to 1526, Michael Sattler, 1490 to 1527, Balthasar Hubmaier, 1480 to 1528, and Menno Simons, 1496 to 1561. Though influenced by the theology of the magisterial reformers, these men went beyond their efforts to reinstitute a primitive, biblical church and ministry. As a general rule, the Anabaptists rejected the idea of an invisible church, understanding the church as a voluntary association of regenerate saints. They tried to restore the idea of a New Testament early church, free from magisterial complications. This allowed the practice of church discipline, but it meant that the church had no right to impose its views on anyone or to persecute those who opposed it. Friedman identifies the following characteristics of the Anabaptist Church: a visible community of believers united by covenant. A fraternity shared and practiced with love. A commitment of exclusion, ban, as an act of brotherly love. A church of order in which the members submit to authority. A suffering church under the cross. A church that practices voluntarism or freedom of conscience. A church that practices the two ordinances of baptism and the Lord's Supper. The 15th and 16th centuries were marked by two relevant factors. The first was of a religious nature. Catholicism was the main religion in the West and exercised dominance and influence in all social spheres. Despite such influence, the major trademarks were moral deviations, abuses of authority, and a complete inconsistency with regard to the biblical pattern of how the church should impact a society. A new narrative against the gospel is taking hold with unprecedented firmness. The big problem is that many Christian leaders have bought the idea that Christianity does not work in biblical, traditional, and historical ways, causing the Christian faith itself to be rethought. Instead of restoring the purity of the gospel, it is being adulterated with anti-Christian philosophies so that it may present a less offensive form to opponents of God, the Bible, and His people. This is why the Protestant Reformation is important to study. Just as when a machine isn't working right, nobody tries to change the instruction manual to get it working properly again, rather, it identifies and corrects the misoperation in light of the manual. The Reformers were able to question the infallibility of the Church without questioning the inerrancy of Scripture. The main assumption of the Reformation was the fact that the Church needed to be corrected and the Bible needed to be exalted. Never the other way around.